Okay, we're going to take questions, and I'm going to stand so that I can make sure I can see everybody on this side of the room. Do we have a microphone? I think that's it. Yes. Yeah. Okay, so we're just running that.
Thank you, Kirstie. This is really interesting. I want to ask about the source in organizations of the structural lie. I want to try to understand what the feature of large-scale organizations is that tends to give rise to them, to help me get clear about exactly what they are. And I have a feeling this may bear on that last very quick distinction between the factual and the ideological. But it seems to me there are at least two different stories you could tell, and I heard you pointing in both of these directions at different points. Sometimes it sounded as though it's something like the hyper-developed division of labor, right? You get a division of an organization that is tasked with something as narrow as just producing signatures, or you get the outsourcing of the production of documents to a company that is concerned only with fulfilling environmental impact reports for pay, right? And somehow that produces the conditions under which a more panoptic sense of the point of that activity in the larger structure of the organization disappears, and they start caring only about doing it efficiently on a kind of Taylorist model. Mm-hmm. The other possibility, though, came from, I think, from your discussion of Vaughan, which is that it's not so much the production of thoughtlessness through the narrowing of activity, but it's actually the tendency of organizations to try to reflexively create structures that account for their own routine mistakes. That's the problem. And that's the problem not because it causes or gives rise to the mistakes, but it's a problem because it literally normalizes them, right? It creates the set of conditions under which an organization can be indifferent toward the question of whether the outcomes it produces in any particular case do or don't conform to the norm, because they've got that all taken care of in some larger structure of risk management through which they reflexively try to account for the fact that a highly Taylorized system will throw up mistakes on a regular basis. But those seem, I mean, those point to very different pictures of what an organization is and where its pathologies come from as the source of the structural lie. And I wonder whether it's one of these or the other for you mostly, or both of them, or some other thing, and maybe especially also how that relates to the two kinds of structural lie you were talking about at the end, which strike me as closely related to each other, even if the second would require a different story.
Wow. Short version. How to explain this? Well, the shortest version is I don't know the answer to your question. Either part of it. But I do think, here's what I think might head in that direction. If you have the tolerance to read some of the literature in organizational behavior and some of the management journals, one of the most curious things about, I had never had the occasion to do this before, and one of the things that's very interesting in the best of the work, and I think Vaughan is I don't see any reason to regale you with work that is not the best of its kind, and Vaughan is just really first rate, is that this literature is all aiming toward the introduction of forms of reflexivity within, or this is what I mean, is they have left Weber behind, as they have left all military and command models behind. You can think of this, I mean, we think of capital in the stage of flexible accumulation. Well, think of organizations in the age of complexity theory. Internal questions of reflexivity and communications and critical communications are part of the agenda of research on these things and within the organizations themselves. So I'm not sure that I'm ready to decide one way or the other, precisely because all of this appears to be under construction. And I will say, though, that the distinction that is regularly made is between high reliability organizations, a distinction that is so pervasive that they are simply called HROs, acronymically, without any explanation to, they don't expect people who are not of their tribe to be reading their scholarship, apparently. HROs, high reliability organizations, have a couple of characteristics. One of them is they're very highly resourced. They do not want resources. So some examples, which are not without mistakes, this doesn't mean that they're perfect. NASA is a good example in its heyday. That has become somewhat more problematic. So high reliability organizations have a lot of resources. They have a lot of internal reflexivity and communication. And they know that every change that they make introduces the possibility of new mistakes. But they also know that the longer they keep any procedure operating as is, the more routinized it becomes, the more thoughtlessly it is performed by its tasks are performed by those who are supposed to do it, and so the possibility of mistake goes up that way. So when I say that these organizations are, and the quote organization science, which is studying them, are functioning within a proto-reflexivity model that the best of it is, I think, informed by complexity theory in one way or another. It's hard to take one path or the other as you have set it out for me. So that would be my answer to the first half of your question. The second half is actually shorter, and that how does this pertain to my two kinds of structural lies? Here is where I think that, I guess my Clausewitzian moment is, I don't believe in general theories. And so I think it makes a big difference what kind of organization you're talking about. And in that respect, it's a big difference between looking at the contingent and eventually all too comfortable relationships between the Mining and Minerals Service and the various the regulatory agents. This is an old story in American politics, is the relationship between the regulators and the people they're supposed to be regulating. But there are forms of intimacy, and there are other forms of intimacy, and this got pretty yeah, got pretty close. But there's a difference between that and the, when I talk about Arendt's work on the odd role that bureaucracy plays in imperialism, where it becomes infused with and enchanted by, if I can use that term, ideology of some particular kind. It's hard to translate that directly into, that is in terms of any kind of content, into these big administrative structures. So if I were to make one modification that I think would be generalized, it would have to do precisely with the love of organization itself. That in the way that is the analog to ideology in its substantive sense, whether it had to do with race or whether it had to do with the endless accumulation of capital or the pure pursuit of profit, as it is in many of these organizations. The analog is the fundamental belief in the machine itself, and that any kind of glitch along the way can be addressed by more regulation, more administration, more attention to the perfection of its organization. And this is where, in closing, I try to suggest that, we make the routine distinction between politics and administration, in a certain sense, is what I had to fight in myself in order to begin to think this paper. Precisely because we assume, I don't mean to speak for anyone, but myself and the little tribe that I often run with in political theory, for whom nothing could be less interesting than administration, except maybe the military.
Mr. Lodge.
Hodge. Roger Hodge, from no institution. I want to push you a little bit, because I'm very surprised by the way you went in the paper. When you started talking about structural lies, I thought you were going to go in a completely different direction. And then, especially given the examples that you used, two of which are very intimate, politically, financially, criminologically, if I can spit that word out. There's a word in criminology, there's a word for the phenomenon that we see with derivatives and robo-signing, and that's accounting control fraud. And a derivative is simply a bet. It's a bet that something's going to happen one way or another. And it was discovered in 70s and 80s that these contracts were very easy to trade and they could be synthesized into bonds. And so the mortgage-backed securities became very profitable. Now, there's a finite number of people who could qualify for mortgages, so you create a fraudulent system to generate more mortgages so that you can package them into mortgage-backed securities. And that's the story of the last few years, is how that all came crashing down. Robo-signing was, and there's an enormous body of journalistic literature on this, robo-signing was a side effect of that awesome hunger for fraudulent mortgages. The mortgages themselves were fraudulent because people lied. People lied about their means to pay and so on and so forth. The origination of the mortgages was fraudulent on the part of the brokers. The packaging of them in securities was fraudulent because the banks promised that these mortgages were AAA paper. Then when all of these things start crashing down and they're faced with trying to pay off the purchasers of these mortgages, they have to come up with something, so they're going to try to foreclose as many things as possible to keep that revenue stream going, to keep the Ponzi scheme going. So rather than an organizational imperative that the organization itself is making these mistakes because it's so focused on its perfection, what we really have is systematic fraud, top to bottom. And the big lie that I thought you were going to go after was the explanation that nobody is at fault, that it is an organizational imperative. And it seems to me, and this is what I find kind of mind-blowing here, is that from my perspective, the structural lie is the narrative that comes out of government and media that wishes to paper this over and make us all think, oh, this was just a big accident. And in that sense, I'm sorry to say, I don't mean to be mean, but it seems like you're participating in that structural lie.
Oh, gee, if I were you, I would have been meaner. I take your point, but I think, this is really going to sound like weaseling, but systematic fraud can only be a retrospective judgment on the basis of facts. In other words, it is one thing as a matter of public discourse, which is what journalism is about, is the contribution to public discourse. And it is one thing to say journalistically that every single mortgage in the entire period originated in fraud. It was systematically fraudulent from top to bottom, etc. It seems to me that the actual judgment of what was or was not fraudulent is a judicial procedure and not something that is the provenance of the press. However necessary the press may be, and indeed it is, to bring these things to public attention. And certainly we saw a lot of reportage on the first reaction was that these were, of course, all people who never would have gotten mortgages in the first place. Weren't they all black people in Baltimore or Chicanos in Los Angeles? And we've just extended too far this notion that all Americans should have their own home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That was the first wave. I'm not convinced of that either, and the little bit that I have seen, and as I say, all of this is still very much in process. So when I talk about the structural lie, by focusing on, this is what I meant to do, perhaps I didn't do it as well as I should have, by focusing on Arendt's notion of records and documents as the sort of baseline facticity that establishes our common world. That means that when that baseline of facts becomes caught up in what I'm calling the structural lie, then the possibility of public trust itself is destroyed. And in that respect, this is, I mean, gosh, I just realized I might be sounding like Sheldon Wolin in Inverted Totalitarianism, that this is the same consequence that Arendt talks about, the destruction of public trust, in the sort of routinized lying under totalitarian regimes. But the kind of destruction of public trust that I'm talking about is at the level of documents and records. What we make of those, I mean, Arendt was not a barefoot empiricist, to say the least. I mean, that trust in records and documents, that is all the reality there is. That is all that guarantees our common world, is precisely the documentary record. So that when we have our political fights and our arguments, when we have our social movements, when we have crises of both corporate and public life, it is only those facts that finally, when push comes to shove, or as Arendt once would often say, when the chips are down, that give us something upon which to rely, something upon which trust can be rebuilt. So I appreciate your point that in not coming down enough on the individual perpetrators, the big men with big ideas and big aspirations for big wallets. This is true, but I don't think that anything that I have said in any sense exonerates them. But I do think that what I'm trying to suggest is that the judgments of fraud, the judgments of malfeasance, the judgments of criminality or illegality are exactly where they always are. They are in the judicial procedures. But what I'm trying to call attention to is the ways in which the structural lie, as I've defined it, so what I'm trying to do is a kind of redescription of a category that is known to organizational studies, but to read some of that literature, you would think that what was at stake is the organization itself not experiencing suboptimal outcomes. It is almost as if there were no environment, no public, no context in which any of this happened. So this is my dissatisfaction. I mean, I'm sure there are obviously the Vaughan stuff in particular, I think, is important. But so I guess my response would be, Roger, if I may, I'm sensitive to the question, and if there is something that I have suggested that does sound like it's exonerating these folks wholesale, I would definitely back off of that. Maybe what I need to do is be more careful about
pumping up the theoretical side of it.
So so it doesn't look like that, or maybe I should get some language in there about, I don't mean to let the idiots off the hook. But I agree. No, I agree with you. But I do think that it's a mistake to overstate the extent of mortgages. In other words, there's a difference between the universe of mortgages and the sub-universe of mortgages that the most egregious practices had to do with.
That sub-universe is actually larger.
No, I just said there's a difference. I didn't say anything about proportion. If you have numbers on the proportion, I'd love to see them.
Let me interrupt briefly. We had about 4 hands up, and suddenly there are several more. The next question is here, but we have about 3 minutes left. We can go a little longer than that, according to our chair.
Okay. I want to begin with Arendt, but I want to then speak about your thesis. I mean, one of the attractive and infuriating things about Hannah is her distinctions. I mean, she thinks that, everybody sees the difference between the distinctions, and if you don't, you're blind, between authority, strength. She's always doing that. Now, what struck me in your talk is that there are a lot of points that connect up with a lot of her thinking. I mean, the remark you made almost parenthetically seems to me sometimes the key to her understanding of bureaucracy and so forth. That is Kafka.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yes.
for her model of the rule of nobody is Kafka, and thought that Kafka had more insight. It seems to me it's not Weber, it's Kafka. So it rules, and she's much concerned, and it seems to me, as you are, with when you have the rule of nobody, of what happens to responsibility. I mean, this is a kind of passionate concern of her that she's coming back all the time to, is how to talk about responsibility, personal responsibility, political responsibility. At another point, it seems to me that really much of what you had to say, or at least one aspect, fit with what she has to say about ideology. The fictional world that gets created, and in fact, okay, what I find a slight tension in the talk is I don't think anybody wants to, I mean, at least in this audience, I suspect most people are sympathetic with your critical judgment. But mine is a conceptual point. What is really added, I mean, conceptually, by calling this a lie? I mean, the idea, I mean, when you try to elucidate it, it seems to me is that situation, you made it clear that in the beginning that you wanted to talk about lies that don't have to do with intention, and that's the way I heard Roger's question, was really about who's intentional and who's responsible.
Right.
But it seems to me that the closest you came is those kinds of structural ways in which non-facts are taken to be true, to be taken facts. But there seems to me there are lots of ways in which that can happen in the world that are not, that we would, I mean, wouldn't want to call lies. So I want to know, you think you're adding something or illuminating something. I mean, we can call this, you know, the structural malfunctions, all kinds of things, but why, what is really conceptually added by calling it a lie?
That's fair. I guess my short answer would be perhaps I'm too much of a student of rhetoric. Because I think the value added depends on the audience and depends on what presuppositions are. In this particular case, I suppose if this ever gets written up in a more careful manner than a lecture, that audience would have to be stipulated. Clearly, to call this kind of thing a structural lie is to throw down a rhetorical gauntlet, and so it's an attempt to sort of use the kinds of affective and cognitive resources that we all have in common about what we think of lies. Even if we are liars, we hate being lied to. And in that sense, it's an open audience to be able to mobilize the affects and cares about that term into this other domain, which is most notably talked about in malfunction, for example. I mean, this is a word that strikes me about as powerfully as suboptimal organizational outcomes. And so, yeah, it is a rhetorical gauntlet, but it's also a matter, I think, of being able to raise to consciousness, and I had hoped to be more clear about this, the difference between the anodyne, anesthetic ways in which these things are talked about among the professional chattering class that talks about them, and the real stakes at the end. And that's why I actually started with them. I mean, this part of the talk was quite intentional to start with the military, as I didn't expect this audience to have much positive affect toward the military, but we all know the consequences of these mistakes when they happen to the military. And a lot of the examples that I use sort of have that kind of gravitas to them. So I agree. So what is the value added? if you think philosophically or conceptually in the absence of the rhetoric of an audience and occasion, probably nothing. I'd be willing to grant that.
Kirstie, a really provocative paper, but I want to go back to the one work of Arendt that I think you are thinking of, but not mentioning. And I want to draw out the implications of this. And this is Iseman in Jerusalem. I mean, understandably, maybe you're staying away from that text, and I don't want to get into some of the major issues about guilt, banality, but you know, that book is about bureaucracy. It isn't just the imperialism discussion,
Right.
and
No,
you know,
no,
that
right.
book was one of the first to take seriously. I mean, there is a whole literature also historically about National Socialist bureaucracy, and I want to pick up just 4 features that are echoed in your description of current organizations. Hierarchy and impersonality. Who actually gave the order for what? And the fact that you can kick the buck up or down and depersonalize it. Language distortion. That you don't really know who you're talking about or what you are transporting, right? Again and again. What is Iseman transporting? Right? Third, covering up of errors. Depersonalization suggests, again, the possibility that, again, a responsibility sort of disappears. And fourth, the kind of criminal dimension of struggle within organizations. I mean, there's a whole debate also around with the Frankfurt School and Franz Neumann as to the degree to which the Nazi bureaucracy was the Weberian bureaucracy, or whether these were also a bunch of basically criminals who were adopting or practicing also sort of, you know, what seem neutral methods. Now, this raises a larger question, and I appreciate that, you know, this is not something that maybe one can get into right now. There's something in your paper that is saying, is this kind of organization itself totalitarian? Can there be democratic administration? Or is all administration with this model of organization inherently, somehow, anti-democratic, quasi-totalitarian? I mean, you invoke Sheldon Wallen at the end, and we know in his last book he comes very close to this.
He comes very close,
Admittedly, that's a larger question. But
Yeah. Thank you, Sheila, very much. I think the place where my thinking on this is most vulnerable, and I should probably thank you in advance for not mentioning it, is this notion that I take from Arendt, actually from The Human Condition, that these documents, records, memoirs, etc., suggests that we are finally, for the factual realm of human affairs, indebted at some fundamental level to Homo Faber, to the making of those documents. So when I say this, because the 4 features that you note, hierarchy and personality, language distortion, depersonalization of responsibility, and structural conflicts within organizations, all have to do with features of bureaucracy that are, at this point, well known, and that I think that this is exactly why the question of, well, can we have these kinds of large-scale organizations, public or private, that are administratively organized, without verging upon some, I don't know whether you would call it, I mean, Sheldon wants to call it inverted totalitarianism. I love language too much to love that phrase. But perhaps, I don't know, maybe he'll pay me to give him a better phrase. But your question about whether they are inherently anti-democratic, that too could be phrased as non-democratic, but that's a huge question. But it also doesn't verge toward this question of man the maker. And indeed, the problem, because it seems to me that the way Arendt describes Homo Faber is largely on the model of poiesis, of having something in mind that you bring into the world in your making. And she of course takes that from the Greeks, and especially from Plato. Eichmann, in his thoughtlessness, had nothing in his mind. That's exactly why. That's exactly how the phrase "the banality of evil" achieved its traction, I think, for Arendt, and why it sent a huge portion of the public into paroxysms of furor, precisely to describe the thoughtlessness of this bureaucrat, this little automaton. Talk about a robo-signer, just sort of going through the procedures. Here's where what I'm trying to do in calling attention to the basic, I would say, hope, certainly no more than that, of the accuracy of the records that govern things and practices in the world. The idea that there is something at stake in these things being as close to close approximations as they can be to what is the case. That's a baseline from which what follows in the direction of politics is rather open-ended. But I would suggest that to the extent that this phenomenon that I'm calling the structural lie suggests looking at the line that we often assume between politics and administration, I think the next step would be to understand that determining where that line lies is a political question and not an administrative question. That is, it is a question of public concern and not something to be left to bureaucrats and legislators and scientists or social scientists. And in that respect, I could give some examples of things like participatory budgeting in Brazil, varieties of ways in which the question of expert administration of all kinds of things has been opened up to possibilities of democratic participation. And I understand we're going to be talking about transparency. I don't like that word transparency because that actually does have a kind of surveillance side of it. But I do think publicity is not the same thing as transparency. And I think that a lot of these democratic interventions or pressures on these large-scale organizations, whether both public and private of all kinds, that press them for public accountability and for, in some cases, participation. I think the Brazilian participatory budgeting is probably most noteworthy among them. That's where I think the democratic possibilities, that I don't want to say possibilities, I'd say the direction of, if I had a democratic part of this argument, that's where it would have to go. Yeah.
I know that there are some of you who have to leave at this point, and we're going to take one more question, and that question is actually the gentleman with the periwinkle tie right here. That would be you. And actually, just ahead of him.
Yeah, I think the big problem is that there is a fault line in the structure. The mortgage broker gets a commission, he tells his client to lie. The underwriter is getting paid by the client who is underwriting, and that clouds his judgment. The director of a brokerage firm is accepting deals that smell to heaven, but they're making money for the company. Financial consequences, personal consequences for letting something go through might help the whole thing. But your entire structure also mentioned that politicians can collect money from corporations and then give favor to them. Whether maybe that's been that way since Abraham's time, I don't know. Whether that can be corrected, I have no idea. I just want to add one other thing. I think Madoff was an honest thief. He told one lie, and when that lie collapsed, he went to jail. If he dealt in derivatives, maybe the government might have bailed him out.
Thank you. I think that's a very appropriate comment.
Thank you very much. Very much.
Sensitivity to language.
Suddenly there were
Pardon?
five
I
more
love your
questions.
sensitivity.